Hello, 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 and welcome to Thursday Night Live with the Wellness Resource Center. It is April 30th, and we are here for another live stream conversation and are so excited that you're tuning in. If this is your first time tuning in to Thursday Night Live, welcome nonetheless. And if it's not your first time, then this will probably be a little repetitive, but it bears repeating. That this is a dynamic digital gathering where we are so grateful to have a special guest on today who will be introduced in a moment. But before I go into that, it again bears repeating that if you've ever interacted with the WRC on campus, that we thrive on those interpersonal connections where we are listening to each other, talking to each other, and responding in a way that is compassionate, respectful, trauma-informed, and engaged in both language and action. And so I'm just kind of reiterating that that is our expectation for folks participating today. We want to hear from you. Please drop a comment on our Facebook stream. I'll be monitoring and responding and bringing up questions as you pose them. So please don't think that this is just us talking to each other. This is meant to be a really engaging and connected way of all of us continuing the conversations that matter to us in person. We're just online now. So with that being said, I'm so excited to have Dr. Karen Roybal here with us. Karen, maybe do you want to introduce yourself? Do you want to be introduced by someone else, like the celebrity you are? Do you want to say a couple words maybe about what you do in Southwest Studies and your areas of study or interest?
Sure. So thank you, Isa. I'm Karen Roybal. I teach in Southwest Studies at Colorado College. I come out of an American Studies PhD program, so our program in Southwest Studies is interdisciplinary, and so is my training. So I teach courses on autobiography, Chicano and Chicana literature, environmental justice, and archives of power. So as you can see, the course offerings are pretty broad, but I think that the sort of connecting link, right, is this idea of stories, because in each of those courses, we talk about stories of peoples and places of the Southwest. And so I'm happy and excited to talk about some of those stories today with you all.
Yes, we are so happy.
Yes, we're so excited to have you here. I'm Heather Horton, Director of the Wellness Resource Center. I use she, her, and hers. And Karen, I'm really interested in the way in which you use narrative, personal narrative, to challenge dominant narratives that we sort of function under, like patriarchy and racism. And I'm just curious, I'd love to hear from you about why you think testimonials and personal story can be such powerful tools in that work.
Yeah. So I want to thank Heather because we worked together really closely on one of my courses in the fall, which was a course on autobiography and self-representation in the Southwest. And so one of the things that really drew me to this idea of storytelling, right, is that our communities, and here I'm talking about my own community, I grew up in a small rural town in New Mexico, and storytelling is one of the ways in which we communicate our history. And because we didn't find our own stories told in dominant narratives, we maintain those stories through oral traditions, through documenting them in poems and stories and songs. And so that's always been at the core of the design of my courses, the curriculum, the types of stories that I engage with and invite my students to engage with as well. So the other thing to think about, right, is that often those stories that we tell, and here I'm thinking specifically about communities of color, aren't valued. And so how do we find ways to bring that valuation, right, into those dominant narratives and really challenge those dominant narratives? And so that's something that's been important to me throughout my life. But now that I have the opportunity to work within one of these dominant structures, right, how do we also challenge those dominant narratives here through practices of testimonio, oral history, poetry, and song?
Well, one of the things that I find in my work that I've just found really interesting. I've always sort of just, I think as human beings, we intuitively know that narrative or storytelling is important because we grow up hearing stories, right? Bedtime stories, oral histories in our cultures. But in my work as a psychologist, I was profoundly impacted by learning about the way in which our brains work in constructing story, especially when we experience things like trauma, and the importance for our own healing in being able to put a story back together after we experience something traumatic. And I know in the class that we collaborated, that you invited me into, which I'm really grateful for, that was one of the things that was really interesting in the conversation with the students, was around like the power for the person of telling their story, and then the power of an audience in hearing that story. And as we were getting ready for this broadcast, we were really interested in that sort of dual role that narrative can play.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the I guess interesting parts, right, of that course that we collaborated on is that it is a course on mostly literary representations, but those narratives, right, we can't read those narratives without also understanding those histories and the ways in which issues of trauma impact generations of folks down the line. And I think many of the works that we ended up reading in the course, at least during that first iteration, reflected, right, that generational trauma that gets passed down and the ways in which trauma is embodied by the future generations. And then how do we deal with that, right? And one of those ways that we talked about in the class was through writing about it, right? And how do we enact change through those narratives as we sort of think through those larger histories, those very complex histories that are traumatic, and from which we have to heal, right? What are the stories that are being told in order to cultivate that healing through a process like writing? So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that we think about, right, trauma and healing, and then acts of ways of managing, right, of dealing with and thinking through all of these impacts that those stories have on us and that continue, right, into the next generation. But also it's also a form of remembrance, right? Is that even if we're making attempts to heal from those traumas, that we also have to remember those traumas. That might sound kind of strange, but
No, I think it's a really powerful thing. It reminds me of today is the last day of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and typically in this week of this month on the CC campus, we're doing the Take Back the Night event, and that remembrance piece for me is really important at this time, because in my career, I've spent most of my career working with survivors, and so Take Back the Night is always a moment where I try to stop and try to remember all the folks that I've worked with over the years, because they have a powerful, by sharing their stories with me, they have a really powerful impact on me in my life. And that idea of remembrance really resonated with me in that. And I don't know, Montana, if you had things you wanted to add to that about.
Yeah, I don't know. You kind of caught me deep in thought, but I was just like, because it less about Take Back the Night, and I was just thinking about just the fact that the kind of like stuckness of the rupture of trauma, and in the ways that it makes sense to that remembering through narrative is a much different thing than like remembering, than being like confronted with memory consistently as kind of like repeating a repeated rupture. And like I don't know, I just like kind of got lost in thought about that piece of placing into narrative and being able to put this event or this time period or whatever that is into this kind of like living thing, I guess. That it's like contextualized with like the way that resilience then gets wrapped into it when it's tied to the things that happen after, the things that came from, and the things that led to. And like I think that just like from a personal perspective, that is definitely something that like I've experienced and like have had so much inspiration from like seeing the way that like writers I admire, artists I admire are able to like take ownership of the traumas that they've experienced and weave that into story that then is like so part of their aliveness, I guess. So yeah, I really appreciated that.
What's also interesting about Take Back the Night, so we usually have like a survivor speak out at the end. So that's when some survivors feel empowered on the spot, or they've been planning to kind of tell their story. But Take Back the Night also plays a role in kind of institutional memory, and where those personal narratives fit in, because last year, and we were planning to do it this year, on the March we stop at South Hall, which used to be Slocum Hall, I understand. And so CC's been kind of engaged in the narrative around Slocum the past few years, I've noticed. I don't know if you saw the display in the Warner Center where I suppose it's an attempt to confront his legacy, although I've heard a lot of different opinions on students on, how that story is told. But my point being is there's telling these stories as happens on a lot of different levels, as you were talking about earlier, like generational trauma and passing those things down. But yeah, and because Taking Back the Night is literally, it's about acknowledging the history on these campuses where maybe women in particular aren't safe to walk around at night. And so it's kind of speaking to that narrative and reclaiming it, so to speak. But yeah, just a little bit more about Take Back the Night and what we would have been doing. Oh, and a quad, because we also did that for changing the name, where some students from NASU came and told that story too. So
that's I was just about to bring that up, Anna, that like when I think about narrative and storytelling and tradition of those things, like the plasticity of a story and a narrative often comes to my mind, not in the sense of like, oh, this is not exactly how this story was told, or like these important details were lost, though that happened. I think about that plasticity in a way of, in an expansive and hopeful way, that when I was a student, Take Back the Night was not an event that I associated with any narrative or story of my own, and that had to do with larger narratives and stories about who experiences sexual violence, who's worthy of being heard, who is centralized, who do we picture in our head when we think about advocating or preventing sexual violence or standing with survivors. And it's been just like really a treasure, and I don't use that word lightly, but a treasure to work with students this year, and Montana as well, to like think and talk about like, what message do we send? What is the narrative or the outward perception of this one particular event? And how are we in control of what people think about this? Like, it's no, neutral thing to have the Colorado Springs Women's March led by Indigenous women. It's no small thing for CC Take Back the Night to hold space for NASU students who wish to speak out, on Tava Quad. Like, when I think about narrative, I think about the ways that it stretches like putty or something, that it's maybe narratives or stories. I think the way I think of them, it's like I'm holding it, but the way I'm holding it isn't always the way it will be. that if I've been given a story or given a description or a conception of how things are, that at least in some respects, I have control over whether I pass along the same narrative or I switch it up, whether I, take some steps to maybe change culture and challenge norms and change the narrative, or if I regurgitate perhaps the narrative that was given to me. I think there's a time and place for it all. I'm not really putting a moral judgment, but just kind of adding the piece that I appreciate in most narratives, that there's space for things to change a little bit, and hopefully for the betterment of everyone.
And that piece around whose stories get told and honored really relates to, it feels to me, Karen, the work that you've done around sort of reclaiming stories, reclaiming language, even to frame things that the people affected by them get to exert some control there and to take some power through that storytelling process.
Yeah, for sure. And I think about, some of the works that I assign sometimes will have Spanish in them, sometimes it'll have an indigenous language. And the students and I talk about, right, that maybe that part of the story isn't for you, right? It's not for me. But, right, it is a significant part of that story. And it's a claiming of that story, right, that needs to be told, right, for that process of healing to occur. And also I want to emphasize, the significance of Isa's point about that sort of idea of the stretchiness, right, of these stories. One of the books that we read in the autobiography class is Norma Cantu's Canicula, which is what she labels a fictional autobioethnography. And so some parts of the story, right, you don't know if it's true, but it's rendered, right, in some way that it follows her family, this character Azucena, right, her family story. But some parts we don't know if those memories, right, are faulty. Is that the right person in the picture, right? But what does that matter, right? It's that part of that story is being told, right, that needs to be told in order to, one, document the family history of life along the Texas-Mexico border, but it's also a space in which, right, the author is processing, right, all of those feelings of a life lived, right, of what it means to be, for her, a border subject. So I think that thinking about, right, sort of expanding the confines of even what we think about, or the boundaries around those narratives that we privilege, right, that we also need to think about what's not being told, right, what's in those sort of like interstitial spaces within the narratives. So I love this conversation, right, because it really emphasizes the significance, right, of like Take Back the Night, right? I mean, allowing those victims to claim their own story and space and feelings and deal with that, right, by being able to talk about and become sort of, I mean, I guess we could equate it to a testimony, right, in a case, right? Like being able to tell their own story is significant. So I appreciate all of the things that y'all are saying here.
I'm also kind of thinking about like the way, I guess, in Take Back the Night, especially, so much of the aspect of that event is like kind of giving testimony, and then the idea of the like community witnessing. And I feel like we've had a lot of conversations in our office, and like Isa was referring to, we had a lot of conversations about this year, like how do you create a space that is receptive and can like hold rather than consume story. I don't know, and I guess I was wondering like how you approach that question in your classes, Karen. Like how do you, is that something you think about and engage students on? like what it means to hold somebody's story that is potentially like a trauma, and a trauma that they might share or they might not, and just what does that look like to, I don't know, I guess in my mind, if there is some sort of like, maybe not rigid binary, but I see those kind of opposing in a lot of ways in terms of like holding and receiving versus consuming, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one of the things that I worked with Heather on in this course was, as we were thinking about the section of the course on storytelling for social change. We talked about the responsibility of storytelling, right? Like who has the responsibility to tell the stories first of all, but then what happens right when those stories are shared with you. So I think that's a great question to consider, right? Because that also puts the onus, right, on who is receiving the story and what is that person or what is that group of people going to do with that story, right? So I think we have to talk about this level of responsibility that also has to be taken as well as we think about the vulnerable place from which people tell their stories and share them. And then what do we do with those stories, right? That we also have to be responsible for being good recipients, excuse me, right, of those stories. So I think that brings up a really important point to think about.
Yeah, and really relates to, was it last week? And now time in this digital world, and Montana's teased me a little bit that perhaps my sense of time, I had some illusions about how in control it was, but I think it was last week that we were talking about being really good bystanders, and how do we notice things in our community and in the people around us, and honor the person while taking action to try to keep our communities safe and healthy, and to create the kind of social change that I think many of us, anyway, my optimism tells me maybe most of us would like to live in. But yeah, I think that piece of how the responsibility we have as receivers of information, and how to use that. And I'm curious about folks' thinking about the ways in which we can responsibly, or can we, right, responsibly use someone else's story.
I just like first thought in response to that, it definitely makes me think of our like how to support a survivor trainings on just kind of a really straightforward level of like receiving somebody else's truth, particularly in something that's really vulnerable, with like articulated support and belief, and like the role that kind of consent plays in that, and then what happens with like that story, whether it's from like, yeah, whether it's in terms of like advocacy or just retelling, or you know, whatever that looks like. And I think like, yeah, just the like, I believe you, thank you for sharing that with me, and like how would you like to be supported? And I wonder how that, you know, if and how that can be applied to you know, like works of art, or you know, broader narratives that might be like either having been passed down for a long time, and like, or stories that are not maybe just like a disclosure in that way of like one person to another, I guess is what I'm saying.
I'm thinking about, as you said, works of art. I'm thinking about the mural Arte Mestiza, which is in the parking lot of the Fine Arts Center, and it was done by artist Emmanuel Martinez. And Nancy, if you're watching, chime in with any information that you have on this, because I know you have it. But yesterday I was having a pretty bad day, and I went there briefly to be held by the art and Tava. And I thought that I was really struck by how real it felt to see images of La Malinche and like pieces of my history that have to do with violence and surviving violence, and just how the artist's act of putting that mural on the wall is an act of telling a story that is for everybody, that there are no real ways to control who sees that mural. Therefore, I think it's safe to assume that the artist means for everyone to see this mural, for everyone to see this and consume like the stories that are depicted. And in this mural in particular, I love it because it spans like across time. You can see different imagery evoking different parts of like Mexican history and references to like European art and all of these different kind of pieces that connect to me. And like, I'm really astounded by how it's not just oral stories that are for healing and social change, but it's anything that can communicate, be that, you know, written, oral, visual, a vibe, I don't know. But I was very struck by that. And if you follow us on Instagram, my Denim Day post, which I posted most recently, features that mural. So if you've seen it around, you know, take another look, because there's a lot there. And the artist himself has been really clear that he's not really pleased with how his story has been preserved, that this mural in the parking lot deserves more than what has been afforded to it. And I'm hopeful that going forward, the Fine Arts Center can honor that, honor his request that his work be preserved. And honestly, like when I met the artist a few weeks ago at a Fine Arts Center event, and it was, I don't know what I was expecting, but like to see the person who kind of was like a leader in telling this story, in creating this mural, it's not like I was underwhelmed at all or anything. I just don't know what I was expecting, but like, I don't know, maybe I thought he would like feel like a celebrity or something, but he felt like just somebody I know who cares about the stories that I care about. And so that kind of makes me just think about like the storyteller, like who is that? Who are they in the community? What kind of cultures prioritize the storyteller and prioritize the telling of stories? I know, like, being Black and Chicana, like, that is a big part of how I came to know pretty much everything about everything, is through a story. Like, we would be doing something, oh, well, you know, you're great, whoever, you know, did I tell you about the story when, like, yeah, I've heard it a couple of times, but you don't say that, you just listen again. So, I don't know, that was just kind of my piece on that.
I think kind of talking about story, like the storyteller and audience, is interesting, and how it can shift. Like that mural is kind of open for anyone to see. For a survivor, it's important to give them that story ownership to them, so that they can decide what they do with it. Their story, they might decide to never tell it, but they might decide they get to decide who to tell it to, when is right for them, especially given that their autonomy and choices were taken away, and like the act of sexual violence itself. So like their story is a way to have ownership over that, and they can be survivors are allowed to tell it how they want to or not. It's just interesting having that control over the story versus through art and putting that up there for anyone to kind of, you know, take in or consume. So I don't know what my point is with saying that, though. I lost the train of thought. But yeah, I guess the importance of like story, like for the storyteller, and what they expect to get from the audience or want from the audience or don't want, I suppose, and just that interaction again.
Yeah.
It's really brave at Take Back the Night to go up there because I don't have control over stupid reactions, like that might happen. You're taking a risk yeah, sometimes there might be reactions that are not favorable, I suppose. But I'm happy to say that it hasn't happened at Take Back the Night. But point being is like, yeah, sometimes it is a risk to tell your story, but it's important for the survivor to have, I guess, ownership over that risk, I suppose.
Well, that speaks to the purpose with which we tell our own stories, right? So a survivor at Take Back the Night, there might be so many different reasons that they choose to do that, right? Might be, I'm tired of being silent. I feel empowered to be heard. I'm angry. I want to be a part of this experience. So many different things. And sometimes the reactions of people who are our listeners matter more to us depending on the purpose. And so for like a lot of survivors that Take Back the Night, the purpose of telling might be to feel heard, to feel understood, valued, those kinds of things. And that helps to build their healing. But the conversation about the teller reminded me, Karen, about Dr. Jacoby, yes, who came to campus and is a teller of other people's stories, but with really important purpose. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that kind of purpose in storytelling.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I want to say, like, hearing all of you talk about, right, the storyteller and sort of this idea of purpose, I think in many ways, right, the mural that Isa is talking about, right, I think that that artist also wants to be seen and heard, right, visually in the same way, right? And not that the survivor versus, right, this artist's story are exactly the same, but there is this need to be heard, right, because they haven't been. And for the artist in particular, it's been decades. For these survivors from trauma, it could also be decades, right? So I think that there is a connection there in people wanting to be heard or seen and matter, right? With Dr. Jacoby, I think we read a biography that he wrote in the course, and it was about a gentleman named William Ellis, who takes on or appropriates a number of identities, right? But I think what was significant about the way in which Dr. Jacoby wrote that biography was that he included the family in the retelling of William Ellis. And in multiple ways that family was impacted, right? Is that they could finally get the story of their ancestor told. And they knew that Dr. Jacoby was invested in this idea of being a responsible storyteller. So when he goes out to promote the book, which he did when he came to CC, one of the family members comes with him, right? So that he's not the one, he tells a part of the story, right? But he also invites the family to also tell their part of the story, their memories about the stories told about this person that go back for generations. And so I think that's an important part of thinking about, right, the responsibility of the storyteller, but also being responsible to your audience, right, and giving them alternative understandings, right, of where those stories come from. Like he's a historian, of course, he did archival research, but that's not the only way that he gained understanding about this figure, William Ellis, that he writes about, right? He's reliant on those family stories that were told and passed down through generations. And for the family, I think it was very significant to have their ancestor story told, right? So that's one way in which Dr. Jacoby contributed to this idea of healing for that particular family. And he's established a friendship with the family now, right? He goes to, I think, some of their family functions, which doesn't always happen, right? So I think that was significant in thinking about this idea of responsibility of the storyteller and their role, and how do they interact, right, with others, especially those people who receive the stories. Does that get to the point you wanted to emphasize, Heather?
Yeah, and it also makes me think about the role of the community in receiving a story, right? So that piece of Dr. Jacoby being responsible to his audience, right? That he's wanting to provide them with information that can be useful to them in particular ways. And I think, as a human being, he has an agenda with that, which is an agenda I'm pretty on board with in terms of some of the social change that he's trying to accomplish, and in challenging folks to think about what stories do we hear, what creates the dominant narratives in our culture, and the responsibility that we have as individuals and as communities to think about what stories are we not hearing as we're, sort of going through our daily life in our communities. And certainly that's true with sexual violence. Issa's alluded earlier to the idea that many folks from marginalized communities have not felt like they've been a part of the violence prevention movement over the decades. And so I think, that movement is becoming much more inclusive and responsible in terms of like, who are we not hearing from? Because this is something that affects everyone, every community. But also, one of the things that we were talking about as a staff is, we kind of focus on 3 primary areas, even though we take a very holistic look at well-being, but we focus on violence prevention, and we focus on substance abuse prevention, and along with that, addiction and recovery, and we focus on mental health, suicide prevention. And the same is true with all of those issues, right? That there are marginalized communities who haven't been fully recognized in those movements, and that their stories don't get told. And certainly on our campus around things like sexual assault, mental health, and substance abuse and addiction, there are some dominant stories that happen that are, we have a responsibility as community members to shine some light in some other places, I think. Yeah, curious what resonates with folks.
I'm kind of just tossing out how might narrative and normative be words that function in really similar ways in a community, that when we hear something about this is how things are done, this is what we do here, you party at college, you drink, you smoke, you do these things, that while that is a narrative, it's also a normative dominant narrative. And I think it's critically important to name that as such, because I've talked to students who are I don't really think too hard about what I do on the weekends, or I just kind of go with the flow. And sometimes the flow, we can question the flow, and we can question what are other people saying or telling stories about, that is informing how I behave and what I do. The stories that we hear, I was going to say stories that we hear older brothers and sisters say, from college. I'm the oldest and the first in my family to go to college. But if I did have older brothers or cousins, whatever, who told me about college, I would have an idea about what I'm supposed to do and what I'm supposed to be into. And I don't know. When I was a student, I wasn't really in the mode to question those normative narratives about college life. I was kind of just there for the ride. I don't know. And that has its own implications, that is not impact free. no neutral thing.
I think also when you're talking about substance use and narratives around partying and using in college, I think it's really important for us and even other groups on campus to provide a platform for students who are in recovery, students who don't engage, to tell their stories. And I think a big piece of talking about stories of recovery um, is changing people's perspective, I think, on those dominant narratives, like a lot of storytelling is, but also maybe helping people come to terms with their own behaviors that might be negatively impacting them. That might be, those stories might be the thing that they needed to hear to, help them be in a better place. And I think, it's easy to hear about a lot of stories where people are, binge drinking or having wild parties or whatever, but we don't really hear a lot of the stories of people, staying in on the weekend and having like just as good of a time and maybe preserving their health a little bit more by not, engaging in substance use and that sort of thing. So I think, yeah, and you just got me thinking about the substance use dominant narratives, but I think it's really important for people on campus to provide space for other storytelling, especially around recovery.
That just kind of made me, I'm like, this is maybe a rabbit hole, but to go down, but I just am thinking about like the way we even use the word survivor, and like that, what the narrative that goes with that, and the way that like that in our work, and I do this a lot, that tends to imply survivor of sexual violence. And I just like, I don't know, it's something that I like think about a lot and like don't always know where I fall, and especially in the kind of where things are at right now with like the kind of like believe survivors and like advocacy moment. It feels like language, it feels like part of the dialect that to like engage people and have them know what you mean to need to use it, because I feel like this narrative has developed. But I also like, there are definitely times where I wonder like just like who that word might isolate, who might not feel like reflected in it. And then even just like in the ways that we know like sexual violence, substance use, and mental health are so intimately connected, and like just that like trauma being so associated with other parts of, with those other aspects of our work, and like resiliency and like survival being in those experiences too. I just definitely like, I don't know, I have like some qualms with the ways that like I use survivor, and like know that that the people I'm speaking to will know I mean survivor of sexual violence. And like, especially with kind of on college campuses and thinking about the ways that, I don't know, even like that relates to students in recovery of like, I don't know.
And might also be a contributor to marginalized communities feeling like they're not part of those movements, right? Because folks from marginalized communities are survivors of so many different things, like we talked about with Debbie Howell in terms of resiliency. And I guess when I think about survivorship, certainly all human beings are survivors in some way, shape, or form, right? And so maybe my bias is around survivor of trauma. And like in our work, one of the things that's really important is to recognize that our experience of trauma as a human being depends on so many different factors, right? Both internal and external, that I could experience the very same thing at two different points in my life. And in one moment, I experience it as highly traumatic, and in another, I do not. right? And that has to do with my own resilience. It has to do with supports that I might see in my community, and all of that's so important. And so, yeah, I think that's a really great question to think about. I mean, language is always good to to interrogate, right? But the ways in which our language becomes inclusive or exclusive, or doesn't or does capture what we're really trying to talk about.
Yeah, the survivor label is just interesting. I think it kind of came about to get away around the stigma of victim, the word victim, which I kind of want to get that stigma away, because to me it just means like you've had something done to you against your will, but there's so much shame around being a victim, you know, because the cultural narrative is victim equals weakness, which equals bad or unworthy or something like that. So survivor came around, but I certainly speak to a lot of people who feel like survivorship's thrust upon them with that word, some kind of, they don't feel like they're surviving. I mean, and they feel like they need to get to a certain place to be called that. But also like they feel like it thrusts like a superhuman type thing on them. And I think the effect in the audience can be like, oh, they're survivors, they survived. That's good, when really like the stuff is like a huge tragedy. Like, yeah, you're a survivor, but like you went through something really, really bad. And I think the word sometimes kind of tempers the violence itself for the audience a little bit, taking that victim word away. But of course, like the person who's had something happen to them, I mean, should have a right to call themselves what they want. Maybe none of those labels they feel apply to them. But like in the movement itself, it'll be interesting to see how it evolves, because yeah.
I think it's interesting too to think about the ways that we all come to the way we understand survivor, right, differently in some ways, right, and then similarly. But when I hear survivor, I immediately think about Gloria Anzaldúa and To Live in the Borderlands, where she talks about what it means to live in the borderlands. And even though she doesn't say survivor at all in that piece, really she's talking about, right, surviving in the borderlands, and not only the physical space of the US-Mexico borderlands, but thinking about what it means to carry, you know, she says the 5 races on your back, betrayed for 500 years. And she goes on to talk about all of the trauma associated with that. So I find it really interesting to think about the ways we're all coming together and the way we're thinking about survivor, but also how there's these divergences as well.
That also makes me think of like the term addict in the recovery world, and how not everybody, I mean, there's a lot of people who are going to identify as an addict, you know, for the rest of their life as a means of like connecting with their recovery community, recovery supports, and recognizing that it's kind of like a lifelong journey to be in recovery. But there's, you know, I think there's a lot of stigma around that word, which also makes people like not want to identify with that. And so it's interesting when you talk about survivorship and the word survivor, and who, you know, how people feel about using that term. There's an interesting parallel to the term addict.
I feel like we could probably make like a miles-long list of just words that have a variety of meanings and have been sometimes purposely reclaimed by the very people who were supposed to made to feel bad by that word or feel less than. And I'm thinking like specifically about words that like I encountered in like Chicana feminism with Nancy, you know, chingona, cabrona. Like I learning about like the way Chicanas specifically have just like reclaimed their time, in the words of like, you know, Rep. Maxine Waters, that they're reclaiming words is reclaiming time, in my opinion. That if I can spend the time to explain to someone why I am like, you know, all of these things that maybe you associate with negative, then that opens space for a discourse, for a new narrative. But that's where those things are born. And I'm just continually impressed by specifically like Black and Indigenous communities who do just that, who reclaim their time, their land, their language, who say things for a specific audience, not giving a single anything if others don't understand that. That when you know your audience, like that's kind of a big thing in my opinion. I'm not a writer really, but like I journal, but I bet that part of becoming a great writer is knowing like, okay, who reads me? Who am I talking to? Like, I can't write something for everybody, you know, and that's just a guess. Maybe good writers can write for anybody and good for them, but I don't know. That got me thinking language. Like, I feel like we should have a live conversation on language in particular, because we could go and go.
I also want to share another thought that you just kind of sparked in my mind, Issa, is that I think the point of telling a lot of stories and narratives from different points of view with people, you know, with varying degrees of experience around whatever the topic is a way of kind of broadening the definition of some of these terms and also breaking some stigma associated potentially with those terms. Getting people to see like there's an array of experience within, you know, whatever realm I'm exploring, and people do use, you know, terms in different ways.
Well, I am mindful of the time on my little clock. I may not be good at myself monitoring time in the age of electronic screens all day, but my little clock tells me that it's almost 6 o'clock. So this has been such a wonderful conversation. I want to encourage everybody to think about the role that narrative and storytelling plays in your life and your community. And maybe we could just end, if there are other things that folks want to say, and I definitely want to say thank you so much, Karen, for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to have you here with us to talk about this really meaningful topic.
Thank you for having me. And I'm glad I got to share this space with you all. And I would just say, like, during this time, we're in trying times, right? So make sure that you're getting your stories out, whether that's writing or painting or drawing or whatever it is that you need to do to deal with and heal from the trauma that we're enduring right now. Make time for that.
Anybody else? All right. Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Karen, for being here with us. And we hope to see you